Paige. I'm with Deschutes Public Library, and we're here tonight as part of Deschutes Public Library's virtual programming. Every month, Deschutes Public Library explores a theme, and this month our theme is ancient. And we're joined tonight by Dr. Michelle Ericksen, and she's going to be talking to us about the ancient origins of psilocybin, or as are known in Central Latin America, Los Niños Santos. Our presenter is Michelle Ericksen, who has a Ph.D. She is a bilingual Spanish medicine woman, teacher, researcher, and coach. Her work draws from a variety of wisdom and shamanic practices, as well as from the fields of education, psychology, neuro-biology, trauma-informed practices, quantum physics, and cultural anthropology. She received a master's from Stanford and a Ph.D. from the University of Oregon, and she is also an ordained minister with the Universal Life Church. Michelle, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you, Paige. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to share some practices with you, some history, and I'm really excited. We have about 55 people here tonight, so that's very exciting to have all of you here. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the ancient history going back up to 5,000 years that we have recorded of the psilocybin mushroom that in Spanish we call Los Niños Santos. So we're going to talk a little bit about the mushroom itself. We'll talk about some of the history, and we're going to talk through the lens also of one of our really greatest teachers. Her name was Maria Sabina, a Mazotec indigenous woman who, without her, I don't think we would be having this conversation right now. Thank you to Paige for getting us set up. Thank you to the library for this incredible programming that we're so privileged to engage with. And I would also really like to thank the teachers who've come before me, my teachers who I've learned from, and their teachers. I would also really like to thank the original inhabitants of this land here in Central Oregon, the people of the Warm Springs and the Paiute and the Wasco peoples. They have been incredible stewards, and we owe a great debt to them for their wisdom and their knowledge in keeping this land really beautiful and available to all of us. So thank you for that. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we will get started. Okay, so, and I think that you can see the screen right now. So we're going to go through and we're going to make a run at all of this. So we're going to talk about, here's a picture of Maria Sabina. She is really the grandmother of what the practices and what we know right now. And one of the reasons why we actually know about psilocybin mushrooms, particularly for healing and wellness. And this is a picture of her in ceremony. And then right below this would be a picture of a graphic of psilocybin mushroom. And I'm going to call them Niños Santos because we're really drawing from this incredible wisdom tradition of hers. Here's what we are up to tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the history. We're going to talk about the name, the varieties of names for that you might hear as we're talking about these mushrooms, and why perhaps we're seeing such a resurgence and a renaissance in particularly psilocybin, but also other mushrooms and also other kinds of plant medicines. We'll be talking about Maria Sabina herself, and then really about some right relationship, some practices and considerations too, as we're moving forwards. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is to the artwork on the left. If you'll just take a moment and look at it. This is called visionary artwork, and so you can notice that it's a little beyond the ordinary, beyond what we might think of as sort of like really representative. But this is the same picture, or very similar, where she's holding her hands out, receiving the energies. You can see the energies floating around her. And we will discuss sort of how this relates to her life and her practices. And then also the mushrooms that are growing out of her head. And this represents her divine cosmic relationship with these mushrooms, which she really sees and saw as spirit beings. And then we'll do Q&A at the very end. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And I want to start you with, here with this quote. Maria Sabina herself was indigenous Mazotec, and as such did not speak Spanish. And so this has been translated, this quote of hers, she was also known as a poet and a teacher. So this quote of hers actually was translated into Spanish and then into English. So this is her words, and many of her poetry, she actually said she got directly from Los Niños, from the mushrooms themselves. So transmission, if you would. Heal yourself with the light of the sun and the rays of the moon, with the sounds of the river and the waterfall, with the swaying of the sea and the fluttering of birds. Heal yourself with mint, neem, and eucalyptus. Sweeten with lavender, rosemary, and chamomile. Hug yourself with a cocoa bean and a hint of cinnamon. Put love in tea instead of sugar, and drink it looking at the stars. Heal yourself with the kisses the wind gives you and the hugs of the rain. Stand strong with your bare feet on the ground and with everything that comes from it. Be smarter every day by listening to your intuition, looking at the world with the eye of your forehead. Jump, dance, sing, so that you live happier. Heal yourself with beautiful love, and always remember, you are the medicine. So the reason I wanted to share this quote with you is that it really speaks to the cosmology. It really speaks to her beliefs and the understandings that the world in which Maria Sabina grew up and she inhabited, this interconnection between all things, between the healing with the plants, between the relationship with the stars, looking at healing as this interrelationship with that which was available to her, which was chocolate, cacao, cinnamon, neem, eucalyptus, these different herbs and these plants. So I think it gives us a really nice picture of the world that she inhabited and her beliefs around them. So we're going to go back. So starting with Maria Sabina. Who was she? Why was she important to us? And why is she important to this new psilocybin psychedelic movement? So on the right, I want to sort of orient you a little bit. Maria Sabina is from Huautla de Jimenez, which was still is a small village town in the mountains in Oaxaca. And Oaxaca, you can see, is sort of south and a little bit east of Mexico City. So kind of just really right in the middle of the lower part of Mexico. And she grew up, she was born in 1890. She grew up the daughter of campesinos, daughter of workers in the field, very, very simple people, people who didn't live in big houses. They actually lived in small homes with thatched roofs, very simply growing their own food. She did grow up in a family where her grandfather and the elders behind him were healers. And in her village and in the Mazotec culture, historically, it had been the men who were the healers, using psilocybin mushroom, Los Niños Santos, for many different kinds of healing. Healing in her culture looked a little bit different. As many indigenous people, looking to the landscape around them to build relationships and looking to the plants and herbs to heal. They didn't often have access to hospitals and to doctors the way many of us do now. So really looking to the landscape to see what can be of use. And this mushroom, which Maria Sabina calls Los Niños, the children, right? Because you saw the mushrooms grew in pairs and in groups when you saw the picture. So the children, not the child, the children, sainted children, were used for many things. Were used for healing arthritis, used for healing used in childbirth, used for healing toothaches. And they were given to children in small doses as well. So it was actually the entire culture during different times of the year and for different needs used these mushrooms for healing. Also used for healing things like broken hearts, for example, in different kinds of ceremonies. And so the way that these mushrooms were used were the shaman or medicine person would go out into the field, go to the mountains and go harvest these mushrooms. They were eaten fresh. And different people had a little bit of different traditions, but I want to speak to you a little bit about what's often fairly common in use with mushrooms and other plant medicines, and what many people have in common, whether it's the Mayan tradition or whether it's the Mazotec tradition. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the diverse experiences through the lens of those cultures. But very often, it's not only the mushroom that is part of the ceremonial use. The mushroom is part, the healer themselves, the curandero, which means healer in Spanish, curandera for a female, in this case, Maria Sabina is curandera, would create an altar, bringing in sacred artifacts. There could be candles, there could be crosses, there could be special totems there, perhaps pictures of ancestors. There often is music, and or there could be drumming. These ceremonies frequently take place in the evening when it is easier to connect with the spirit and the medicine of the mushrooms. There would be songs, and often other medicinal, like ointments would be involved, or perhaps tobacco. So know that the mushrooms, while they played the largest role in the ceremony and the healing, they were also surrounded by other aspects of culture supporting the healing for the person who was either ill or unwell. A little bit more about Maria Sabina and how she came to this work. So she grew up in a family where there were healers, but women were not healers. And so at the age, and like I said, they were quite really living close to the land and didn't have a lot of means, a lot of financial resource or otherwise, which meant that often they would be hungry. And at one point, when Maria Sabina was 6, she and her sisters were out in the fields. I believe they were taking care of the animals, and they were really hungry. And so they found some mushrooms, and she recognized those mushrooms as the same mushrooms that she had seen her grandfather working with. So she and her sister, who were quite hungry, laid down in the field, ate these mushrooms, and laid down, and then had this, what we would call like a altered experience. Her hunger went away. She met other beings. She and her sister started to giggle and laugh. And so it was her first introduction to ingesting the mushrooms, and had a really lasting effect on her, because it also introduced her to what later she called were her guides. And she called the book, which was the book of language. And then it was the language itself that came through her. And when she says the language, it was the language of the mushrooms, these beings that have their own consciousness, who came, and she became the vessel for them to speak and to offer healing to her, whoever her patients were. So that experience was quite a profound impact on her, but she grew up as a very traditional young woman in her culture, marrying early, bearing children, tending to the household, the humble household that they had, growing food. And so she didn't get engaged in the healing aspect. And she was also, as I said, even though she had spoken to her grandfather once or twice because she felt called by these mushrooms to become a healer, he said, no, women and girls aren't healers. This is not for you. And over the years, as she became a little bit older and her children a little bit older, this voice wanted to come up through her and ask her to become a healer. Well, one day when she and her sister, they were very, very close and raised their families together. When her sister was really, really ill and close to death, as a last resort, Maria Sabina listened and said, I'm going to eat the mushrooms, and I'm going to see if I can heal you, because it's the only thing that I can think of. So she ate the mushrooms. The story is she ate the mushrooms, and she was able to identify what was wrong with her sister. The mushrooms came through her, told her the prayers that needed to be recited, the songs to be sung. And mind you, this was all as if, imagine a download coming from your computer to your mind and then coming out through you. So this information was downloaded to her, and she healed her sister. And her sister not only survived, but lived for many more years. And so word spread throughout the village. And that was how she started to become a healer, working with mushrooms. And then throughout the course of that, her life changed. More and more people came to her. Remember, this is a remote mountain village with a long history of people going to healers and not necessarily going to doctors as we know it. There was no hospital anywhere nearby. So people looked to their people in their community and who were the healers. So she ended up eventually getting a blessing from her grandfather. Let's say he wasn't thrilled with the idea of his granddaughter becoming a curandera, working with mushrooms, but he understood and eventually was able to see that she was very gifted and that the mushrooms wanted to work with her. As her fame grew and people started to talk beyond her village and outside, in the early 50s, there was a very famous mycologist, and a mycologist is somebody who studies mushrooms, named George Wasson. And he ended up hearing about her and her healing ability because it had spread throughout the region. There's this gifted healer. She works with mushrooms. So he shows up, which was very unusual for Westerners at that point to be traveling through very remote regions in Mexico, and particularly in Oaxaca, which is still quite remote, quite indigenous, even to this day. He shows up and he says, I want to sit with you. And I want to learn from you. And that became a very long collaboration where he, over a course of a number of years, came from the States, came to listen, to work with her, to sit and to actually record her. And so a little bit later, we're going to hear one of the recordings of her singing so you can have a sense of what it might have been like to sit with her. As a result of his sitting and learning with her over a number of years, he actually wrote an article in 1957, and this is very relevant to this conversation today, in Life magazine of all things, called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. And this Life magazine was probably one of the largest vehicles, like social media, right, in the 50s. Like next to National Geographic is how people learned information, right? We didn't have very much television. We certainly didn't have the internet. And so this magazine blanketed, was like viral in the United States. If you think of what was happening in the late 50s and early 60s, right, there was a huge counterculture shift. And so both scientists and counterculture, what we would call hippies now, people started reading this and making their way down to Mexico, down to this little village, Huautla de Jimenez, to sit and to eat the mushrooms and to be in ceremony with Maria Sabina. So all of a sudden, over a short period of time, village life was changing. Right, Westerners were coming, people who weren't indigenous, who were maybe not speaking Spanish, and they were going to her house. There was like these trails of people, and they were really changing some of the city. They certainly changed her life. Not only did she have people coming to her doorstep day after day after day, asking to sit with her, many of those people wanted to ingest the mushrooms for a different reason, and their reason was often to see God, not necessarily for healing. So think of that. There's a big cultural shift. This mushroom has been used for generations for healing physical ailments and sometimes emotional and spiritual ailments. And then all of a sudden, Westerners bring this idea, I want to see God. And so there's a little bit of a culture clash there. There was also a lot of money coming through. And when money comes through with remote places where historically people have been quite impoverished, and we see this in the Amazon right now, what's happening with ayahuasca tourism. So this could have been some very initial and early psychedelic tourism, if you want to think of it that way. It creates a lot of dissension in the community. It can create greed and envy between different people. As a matter of fact, one of the other shamans in the village actually shot her twice over 2 different occasions. He was very jealous of her. So I think it's really important that we consider the impact of our actions particularly we as Westerners, those of us who identify as that, as we move into communities that have been historically marginalized, historically have been very contained, that we move softly. It's like moving into a new environment, in a new landscape. Sorry, you guys, that's my dog. They're both sitting on the sofa up here with me. And so what happened is Maria Sabina was at times ostracized from her village. Her home was set on fire. And I think that's also part of the legacy that we need to understand and really hold gently as we are, as humans and Westerners, moving into these relationships with these plants and animals in new ways that indigenous peoples have held for hundreds and thousands of years, that we move gently, that we think carefully and with caution. Okay, I'm going to go back and share the screen with you so that we can listen to the music that she's singing. And I want to speak with you just for a moment about that. So here's a picture of Maria Sabina in her home. You can see it's very simple. There's her altar. It looks like she's lighting a candle. She's quite an elder woman at this point. And I'm going to move in a second so we can hear the song. I want you to really, we'll listen to it for about a minute. Notice the singing. Notice, we often think that when we sing in ceremony or when we sing to God or the divine, that our voice has to be perfect. Like, I think a lot of us grew up thinking it needs to be angelic. And in many indigenous cultures, as a matter of fact, in the practices that I've learned, we're taught that we were born singing and everybody can sing. And what's important about the singing is that it comes from your heart, not that it comes from, right, this perfect voice. So as you're listening to this music, which is going to sound very different, just notice what you notice. And here it comes.
Santo, Santo, Santo. Mama, way, mama, 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 Hinge Cristo, que so
So there was just a little bit of hearing Maria Sabina, grandmother Maria Sabina, singing. A couple things that I think are really interesting to note. Notice what we would call discordant, right? That the music, really the function of music and ceremony, and particularly working with many different kinds of substances that alter you, which psilocybin mushrooms do, they're altering, is to take the energies and to marshal the energies. It could be to open them, to close them, but she's really guiding the energies. She's singing in her indigenous language, but did you hear Santo, saint, Christos, Christ, so that there's this interweaving and bringing in of some of the Catholic experience as well. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on a little bit. So shifting gears just a little bit, I want to talk with you about some of the history, right? This is no ancient. And we'll look at psilocybin, which is the derivative, or it is the actually acting agent, the psychedelic agent in Psilocybe cubensis, which is one kind of psilocybin mushroom, or what kind of what you might have known as magic mushroom or psychedelic mushrooms in use in Mesoamerica. This picture that you're looking at is a picture of Mayan. They're called deities. There's other names for them, but they're sculptures from the Mayan Empire, or the Mayan time period, the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican period. And what we know is that, what we know here is that, hold on one second. Do we have, okay, no, nothing in the chat. Okay. What we know is that we have records, we have evidence, anthropological evidence and archaeological evidence that humans have been working in Mesoamerica with psilocybin mushrooms and other actually psychedelic plants and herbs for over 5,000 years. So this is a very long history. It is in oral traditions, we can go back even thousands of years beyond that. So these are very long-lasting relationships that we have, and we're at a point in Western society and modern society where we are having a renaissance, like a re-knowing of these, right? These were available and research was being conducted. People were acting on these agents as change agents in the 60s. And then the research was shut down in large part by the Nixon administration, which considered this countercultural and contrary to the direction the government wanted to go in the social direction. So as a result of what happened, what was happening during the counterculture revolution, these medicines that we've always had access to as humans became drugs and became Schedule I, like highly illegal and then enforceable, putting people in prison, the DEA. So we have shifted as the science has reopened our understanding of the incredible power of these agents, how they can help us with healing so many different health, with depression, anxiety, with complex PTSD and PTSD. And this is for people who have not responded to other treatments, right? The way science works when we conduct these experiments, we actually take people who nothing else has worked for them and put them in what we call novel experiments. And so it's so easy to read the literature these days. Every day it seems like there's something new on Time magazine. I think a few weeks ago was the cover story was about psilocybin and the new scientific research. So in these Mayan cultures, for example, psilocybin mushroom was used for magical experiences, transcendental experiences, to experience altered states of reality. It was used therapeutically for different states of beings and ritual settings, for connection and for religious reasons. And if we look today, we are using these medicines, these mushrooms in particular, for very similar reasons, for greater connection to the self, for connection, for intuition, for creativity, for ways to enhance well-being. All you have to do is look at that there are millions of dollars in companies just waiting to open trade for this, to trademark the medicine itself and ways to use it. In Oregon, as you well know, there is the psilocybin-assisted therapy training, which is ongoing. The first program just started that a few weeks ago. And this was mandated by us, by the voters, that our state is the first state in the country to support medicinal and psilocybin-assisted therapeutic training because the research is so powerful. And what I find really fascinating about all of this is that Mayans and Mazotec and other indigenous peoples have been working with these medicines for thousands of years already. And why? Because they work. And the research is just demonstrating that. So I find that really fascinating. So let's talk for a moment. I'm going to go back to the screen. Let's talk for a moment about who could be doing this work. Who was the shaman? Who was leading this work in these cultures and these societies in ancient history? And it was the shamans and the priests, medicine men and women. Historically, in most cultures, it was male. Women less so, and certainly in the modern era, we're seeing a lot more women in indigenous cultures moving into those roles. And it depends culture by culture. There were 4 ways, I think this is really important to note, there were 4 ways that one would become a medicine woman or man or a shaman. The first way was ancestral. And that was that you came from a lineage, like Maria Sabina came from a lineage in her family. The second one was the medicine chooses you. And that was the case with Maria Sabina, particularly as the mushroom spoke to her and said, we want to work with you. She was shown this book, right? The language came through her. The third way is life-altering events. Perhaps not uncommon for people actually across cultures to be hit by lightning, and they become medicine men and women. So they become the purveyors or the channelers of these wisdoms and able to move from this world. And if you look at, right now we're looking at Kisin, a picture of Kisin, the Mayan god of the underworld. And the circle, if you can see it, this yellow circle up on top those are mushrooms, mushroom eyes. That's his third eye space, as we know, is the seat of intuition, the seat of wisdom in many traditions. And they're mushrooms leading him to the seat of wisdom. And the fourth way to become a shaman or a medicine man or woman is the elders or community choose you to be that. And so know that it wasn't necessarily like we do today, like as a profession, like, hey, I'm going to go to school and be a shaman. Yes, there were often schools in different parts of the world. If you look at ancient Greece, the Mayans had some schools as well, but typically the learning was done in situ. You were trained by other priests or other shamans. Okay, now we're going to move to a different world, to the Aztec world. The Nahua people, the people that we call Aztecs, they had their own name for themselves. Nahua, they spoke Nahuatl, which is what we would call the ancient Aztec language. And this is Xochipilli, who's the Aztec god of flowers, song, and play. And so if you just look first at the image on the left, you see these giant earrings, right? And these are stylized mushroom caps, giving homage and connection to the power and the potency that the mushrooms had in their ritual lives, in this connection of play and flowers and life. And if you move to the right, you can see these other plants. And I think this is really interesting to look at how many of these other plants are psychedelic. The morning glory, if you look on the left, this little tendril that you see on his shoulder, okay, morning glory can be psychedelic. The seeds of the seeds can be hallucinogenic or psychedelic, altering your reality. This really beautiful round on the top that says stylized caps of psilocybin. So there's a different mushroom, and there's flowers and buds of different plants. So they are in this beautiful sculpture. They are showing this relationship between the different plants that have been pivotal for their learning and growth and insight, right? The rituals that they hold is really important to speaking with the gods and speaking with the ancestors. And these are the plants that help them gain access. All right, let me show you one more picture. Okay. Actually, we'll stop with the pictures right now. I want to share that it is very common when we look at indigenous artwork that we see these mushrooms in the artwork. And I did not include, because we're talking particularly about Mesoamerica, but there's a really beautiful piece of artwork from an ancient chapel in Great Britain. And I think it's in Canterbury, as a matter of fact. And you see very clearly mushrooms by the saints. If you look at Andean artwork, that's also pre-Columbian artwork, you see cactus, which has its own medicine as part of the artwork. So the artwork, if we look back at the record and we look back at the artwork, it gives us an idea of the relationships between the people and their rituals and their ceremonies, and often the vehicles that they used to achieve those altered states. And what about altered states? Many of us are not familiar with those. We might have read about them now, but there are a variety of altered states that are very common when working with this and other psychedelic or hallucinogenic plants. And so the first state means that you're altered. That means you're feeling reality is different. There's something different. You might feel more of a connection, right? And many of this, and psilocybin in particular, is this sort of interconnection of understanding that I am part of nature. I'm not separate from nature. Nature is part of me. Often participants will see or hear other beings, like the birds might start speaking to them in a language they can understand. This was certainly the case with Maria Sabina, right? The mushroom spoke to her and allowed her to diagnose what was happening with her patients, allowed her to see into their bodies, know the frequencies of their songs that need to be sung, or know what they needed to do afterwards. People might hear music. They might be able to see different colors, lights. So it's a whole, they might travel to other worlds, or beings from other worlds might come and step in front of them and speak to them. There's a psychedelic researcher, psychologist, James Fadiman, who has categorized, I believe, 107 different kinds of altered experiences that humans have. I mean, I love, like, as a psychologist, took enough different, like whether it was mushrooms or LSD, enough trips to say, okay, this is one experience. This is one experience. So there's a whole list. You can do that research on your own. All right, I'm going to go back to the screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's in a name. And you'll notice that I'm using a variety of different words, and I think it's really important to know why we use different words and what they relate to. So Niños Santos, as I said in the very beginning, is the word that Maria Sabina used. My teacher, who has been training me, also apprenticed with Maria Sabina. He sat with her before she died. He's also Mazotec and Mayan. So I'm learning through a variety of traditions. I've also learned from the mushrooms themselves, and I've learned from doing so much scientific reading. My background is in reading scientific literature and doing research. So I've learned from a variety of sources how these medicines work and how to work with them in a ceremonial context. So Niños Santos is out of respect, is what I use in ceremony, speaking with this about these medicines. It's a psilocybin mushroom. There are, in Mexico alone, 50 different species of psilocybin mushrooms, and there's over 230 kinds of hallucinogenic mushrooms, excuse me, of actually psilocybin mushrooms themselves in the world. So not indigenous solely to Mexico, but actually psilocybin mushrooms throughout the world. In Oregon, important to know that Psilocybin cubensis is the only psilocybin mushroom that will be used for these therapeutic work. And that was a decision of Oregon Health Authority. So it's just interesting, I suppose, so that they can really manage it carefully and make sure the dosage is correct. You might hear the word magic mushroom, which some of us, depending on how old we are, grew up with. And then a few other words that often get used interchangeably that I think are really important to understand. Entheogen, entheo, relating theo, God, entheo to, entheogen, that which delivers you to God. So that entheogens are the kind of plant medicines in particular that lead you to a deep relationship with Creator, God, Source. Psychedelic is another word that you'll see used frequently. And hallucinogen is a word that was used a lot in the 60s. We don't use it so much anymore because really we know that these are far greater than hallucinations that we have. So that word has kind of fallen out of favor and away from use. Let's see. Question here about the mushroom, the lower mushroom, which is Amanita muscaria. It's also an entheogenic mushroom. It's for those of us who have European ancestry. This mushroom has been used all the way from Siberia all the way to Great Britain. So the upper northern European realms. And yes, it is, if you know the story of Santa Claus and the flying reindeer, this actually is very much the origin of that, but it is not relative to the Mesoamericas. Okay, I'm going to finish. I want us to look at this slide really quickly, and then I'll come back so you can see my face. Just talk briefly about right relationship practices and considerations, because this is really important, that we are respecting and honoring indigenous practices and worldviews, cosmologies and beliefs and religions of other people, that we're not colonizing, if you would, and we're not commoditizing these other practices. In the Mazotec cosmology, the role of the mushroom, right, the role of the healer and the role of the healing is all interrelated. And so important to know that one is not separate from the other, that they are all united and work together in collaboration for the role of healing, as compared to sometimes in Western mindset, we think it is the mushroom that does the healing. It's not. It's this combination that's very rich and sacred union. Very important practices and consideration of reciprocity, that we engage in these healing practices to benefit all beings, that we know that certainly in the Mazotec cosmology belief system, and also many indigenous belief systems, that these are spirits. They have their own consciousness. That one of my very dear friends and teachers, who's Native American, says this. He says, everything speaks, everything listens, and everything wants to be spoken to. So this belief that we are all related and we don't exist separate from each other. Reciprocity is also very important, that we don't repeat this colonizing mentality. We go to somebody else's home, we harvest their resources, and then we use them and we take the money from them, from these practices, and we use them and turn them into big commodities. That we're really conscious and thoughtful about how we're working, and we're giving back to those communities that we learn from. And then, of course, there's ecological and economic considerations. Okay, this is the place. We've got like probably about 12, 13 more minutes before we need to wrap up. And I am guessing that there are many people with questions. I so appreciate the library for giving us this opportunity to have question and answer together, even though we're not face-to-face. And I will be face-to-face with folks at the East Bend Library later this month, so you can tell your friends if they want to come face-to-face. And this recording will also be available. So Paige will tell us a little bit more about that, but let's move to the questions. Paige?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. This was a really great overview of something that I know, especially in Oregon, as more information, and of course, as you pointed out, all of the upgrades and the updated information on incorporating psilocybin into healing practices in Oregon. We have heard a lot more about these mushrooms, and they've entered the mainstream through people such as Terrence McKenna or Michael Pollan, who we once hosted here in Central Oregon. And yet it's great to have somebody who's talking to us about how this started, and really important figures who are not only our westernized European people who are bringing this information to us as if it was them who created it. So thank you for placing us in history and for honoring the really important work that has been done by women and other marginalized communities for centuries before we even are now here. There's somebody who came in through the Q&A. Michelle, do you know if there are efforts in Oregon to include non-native English speakers in the discussions around psilocybin and around this important work?
So it would be really helpful to have clarity, like in the discussions, do we mean like library discussions? Do we mean community discussions? I can speak to one piece about that, is that I'm working with one of the training programs in Oregon, and we are all of us going through a certification process by the state to do this work legally and under therapeutic settings. And one of the things that our group really wants to be able to do down the line after we've gone through a round or two of this is to really offer this training in Spanish. Um, it is a huge leap, right? Because it means going through a whole different different level of certification, translating all the materials. What I can say is that a number of us have teachers who are Indigenous and Native Spanish speakers, and we are bringing them into the work. We've invited them into the work that we're doing. We've invited them to train us. I know that next year a group of us will be going down to Oaxaca to work with one of my teachers who's been, right, he has lineage tradition and family and historical traditions doing this, so that we ourselves can be holding these medicines from a variety of perspectives with clear and open hearts, honoring the historical roots, and also as those of us who are teaching Indigenous people who come through this program, because I can tell you that there are hundreds of people who are on the wait list just for the program that I will be working with. And there are, I believe there's like 8 different organizations in Oregon who are going to be doing this work. So we have so many people who have been called and who want to hold space, who want to learn about these medicines, want to learn how to use them in appropriate settings in safe ways. And what it says to me is that's a shift in consciousness. And so as we're working with historically marginalized and oppressed communities, we want to make sure that they have access as well. And to have access, it makes a whole lot of sense. And it's right that they have people from their own communities who can learn and be certified as well. And so, yes, under that circumstance, under that umbrella, if you would, how these conversations are being held, like I would be really curious to know if churches are having these conversations, because many of these medicines actually have been used. As a matter of fact, they're in the Vatican. We had originally, as when the Spanish came over, it was the priests who was noting this. It were the priests who were writing down. It were the priests who were actually observing some of the first notes that we have of some of the Mayan traditions and Aztec traditions were written by priests themselves, who were seeing these powerful relationships that people were having with their gods and their deities. I know of one priest in whose name escapes me, but who in late 1590s, I believe, was down in Peru and documented use of a different kind of medicine down there. And so we can owe this understanding of how the ceremonies worked to this particular priest. And so these things are in the Vatican. Perhaps they'll be shown at some time. We'll be able to learn that way. But I sure hope these conversations are being available to be held in a variety of contexts and languages. Great question.
Absolutely. And thank you for exploring that, Michelle. Information and knowledge is empowerment, and that's definitely a great place to start. And so speaking of the Vatican and speaking of priests documenting the first usages of these medicines for a Western audience, we have someone in the audience who's curious to hear how Catholicism impacted Maria Sabina's use of the medicine, or how it interacted in other Indigenous beliefs. Because as many of us, I'm sure, are aware, Catholicism had a really heavy presence in Mesoamerica, especially considering the Spanish who came over. So do you have any information on that?
Yeah, sure. I do have a little bit. So I want to also put this book out here. This is a book. It's called Maria Sabina Selections, which is also available in English, which I admit I read it in English, not in Spanish, because it's easier to go through it that way. And it is a series of conversations that she had that were recorded, that were then transcribed. They were transcribed, mind you, recorded in her Indigenous language, translated to English, then transcribed into both English and Spanish. In this, she speaks a little bit of her upbringing, and then there's some notes afterwards. In In many indigenous communities, when the Spanish came and they brought Catholicism, the way to both coerce and bring people into the Catholic practices was to allow certain traditional practices to coexist or to become woven into the practices. And so you'll notice that when she sings, she brings in Christ, she brings in Jesus, she brings in the saints. As a matter of fact, she had some of those. If you see pictures of her altar, she had some religious icons on her altars in her home. So there was a coexistence. The priest in the village also was aware, and because these practices are so deeply embedded in the culture and community, there was a little bit of a side-by-side recognition. I can say that having been in Peru and studied in Peru with the Shipibo people who work with a different medicine and singing and learning in Shipibo language, there are still very many Catholic references to different angels, to swords, to types of spiritual work that is handed down through Catholicism. The churches in much of Latin America actually have indigenous symbols woven into the altars, for example. But you have to know what you're looking for. You have to understand the culture that you're in to know how it's reflected in that. So I would say largely these practices were removed, that folks were discriminated from, they were tortured. I mean, of course, these practices happened. And yet there's this incredible resilience in indigenous cultures. And the reason that these practices survive is because of the deep, deep wisdom and resilience and ability of people to, when they needed to keep their practices safe and sacred and secret, they were able to do that. And so, yeah, it both and.
Fantastic. And someone else in the audience was curious, kind of along that same line, if you know if manna was a mushroom symbol in the Bible. Again, a weaving in of different cultures.
I don't. I'm not familiar with plants and medicines of the Middle East. I think it's a really interesting question, and certainly I would encourage the person who had that question to go and do some deep diving. I mean, you know, the Oracle of Google does have a lot of information. You just have to know how to sort through it, right?
And the Deschutes Public Library has librarians also who would definitely be willing to help you out with that research. You can book a librarian, and you can find that information at DeschutesLibrary.org, where you can get a one-on-one with a librarian or just request that specific topics of interest. They will help you research it, and they will help you find these threads that we might not have answers for here, but we will be willing to help you get. As we just kind of wrap up and get a couple more questions in too, Michelle, do you mind please holding up that book again? So the one, Maria Sabina Selecciones. Thank you.
And I also, Paige, before we go, I know we just got a couple minutes at like the last minute or so, I'll switch to share screen so folks can see how to reach out to me if they have any. Okay.
Great.
All right. And do we have one? I think we might have room for one last question.
Yes, anyone would like to bring that in, please feel free. And another note on the library, the Deschutes Public Library has a really great collection of books and materials available for you. And also, we are a popular lending library, which means that we don't have everything. But what we can do is we can get you books and materials that we don't have already. We can either have you order them through the Request a Material tool on the library website, or we can also just borrow them through such tools as interlibrary loan. So if you have specific questions, for instance, that book that Michelle referenced, we don't have that in our collection, but we could find it for you. So please don't feel afraid to ask your librarians and ask your public service specialists at any library to get you specific books or to help you on topics that you want to learn more about. Michelle, why don't you go ahead and bring up your contact information so people know how to get in touch with you after the program.
Super. And I'd really like to thank everybody who took some time out of their day to spend some time with us, to share some of this wisdom. And I hope that you actually left with more questions, because this is a growing world. This is really, we're learning so much every single day about how the power of these practices, of these plants, and of the people who've walked before us. So I want to thank everybody, and Paige and the library, Deschutes Public Library. You are such incredible partners. Thank you so much for making this happen and giving all of us a space to connect with each other.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us tonight. We really appreciate it. We hope to see all of you again very soon in any of your libraries or online. So check out DeschutesLibrary.org for the next fun upcoming events near you. And until then, have a good night, everyone.